Hi, everyone. I'm Summer,
I'm Carrie.
and this is Hopelexia Podcast.
Join us to talk about sex, drugs, and self-improvement.
Hey, thank you for coming, Abby.
Of course.
So I'm Summer, and this is Carrie. She we co-host this, but I don't know if you remember me. I sent you an email last year, I think it was. I was dealing with a child who had conduct disorder, and I was we were looking for everything, and so I was emailing literally anybody I could find contact information for that works in this area, and you referred me to the Facebook support group that Lily runs.
Yeah.
So that's how I met Lily.
Wonderful.
In a way, we could say
that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you created this podcast, Abby. This is all thanks to you.
Yes.
Well, the whole reason we have the organization and everything is just because of all the parents I've met over the years that I just was like, you are not getting what you need. And, it's just such a mess. So, and I vowed long ago, if I could help, I would. And as I'm not a clinician, the kind of help I can directly offer is pretty limited, but we're working toward more options for all parents of kids with this kind of problem. So,
do you also want to explain what site that is and all that for our listeners?
Sure. Oh, are we recording now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, I wouldn't have said anything differently, but so I am the co-founder. So I'll back up. So I am a professor of psychology and also cognitive science and neuroscience at Georgetown University. And I have been studying children with serious conduct problems as well as adults with psychopathic traits for 20 years now, and was part of a group at the National Institute of Mental Health in the early 2000s that was doing some of the first ever brain imaging research with children with serious conduct problems and callous unemotional traits who are at risk for developing psychopathy. And I discovered as part of that research the kinds of experiences the parents were having. That wasn't the goal of the research, but when we were doing the interviews with kids, we would have to get some sort of confirmation of their behavior. And most of this kind of research is done using file reviews, meaning the researcher looks over their files from, an inpatient facility or a detention facility. And I've since learned that not that many researchers who do this work have actually talked to the parents of these kids at length. And I'm not a clinician.
You don't say.
Well, right. So it's very rare. I had no idea. And I'm not a clinician. So, although I'm trained to do, specific clinical interviews. And so I just didn't fully appreciate how rare that is until pretty recently. And also how much it affects the way that you understand the origin of these problems and how much it shapes how you understand the children. To talk to somebody else who has had experiences with them and can tell you their perspective from the outside. And anybody who studies any disorder will tell you how important that is, right? So for example, if you know people with bipolar disorder, their experiences of manic episodes, for example, feel very different than they look to a close friend or family member. And, we know that people with bipolar disorder often don't want to be treated because, for a whole variety of reasons. And I will say this from the perspective of somebody who has lots and lots of people with bipolar disorder in my family. So this is not a disinterested view. Anyways, but you don't really understand the disorder if you're only hearing about it from the person themselves, to be honest, right? Because we all have biases and blindnesses about our own traits. And there's even a condition called anosognosia, which means not even knowing that you have a clinical condition, like failing to even appreciate there's anything the matter that can affect people with strokes, right? There are many people who have strokes, can't use half of their body, right? Don't respond to half of the visual world in front of them. And a significant proportion of them have anosognosia, which means they don't think there's anything different about them. And very common with lots of clinical conditions too. So working with all of the parents I worked with, I think gave me a really important perspective on conduct problems in kids, and also made me believe that parents of kids with conduct problems are struggling more than almost any other parent population out there, with less support, less sympathy, fewer resources, fewer trained clinicians, and deserve a lot better, and their kids deserve a lot better, and the rest of society deserves a lot better. And it made me really want to help in the future if I could. And so that is why I co-founded with Lisa Michael Psychopathy Is, which is aimed to be, to try to fill as many of the gaps as we can. So it's information, trying to be honest and clear about what's going on, because I know so many parents of kids with conduct problems do not get honest, clear information from teachers and pediatricians and clinicians for a whole range of reasons. And, try to present as much good information as we have about the best kinds of diagnostic assessments, the best treatment options, and then screening tools so people can get a realistic sense of what's going on.
If you don't mind me asking, was there something specific that got you wanting to work like with this population, or was it just kind of like a natural, as you went through like all of your school and work and doing everything, you kind of just like fell into it?
Well, I'm interested in empathy. So the real sort of core of the research I do is trying to understand what process in the brain allows a person to care about another person at all, right? And I started from the premise that maybe we don't, like maybe we act like we care about other people, but we don't, and everybody doesn't care about other people, but some people act like they do, right? That could be true. I didn't start with that assumption, but as a scientist, you always have to be willing to consider possibilities other than what you believe, right? And be willing to change your mind as new evidence comes in. I mean, that is the single most important part of being a scientist, is you just have to be willing to go where the evidence leads you. So I was interested in why people care about other people. And that's a really hard question to study in the lab. I'm sure you know about, little laboratory paradigms like the prisoner's dilemma and, do you want to give this person $1 or not sort of studies. And I use them for some purposes, but I don't really ever feel like you're really understanding what causes people to care about other people using by bringing people into an artificial situation and, asking them these limited kinds of questions, and measuring very limited kinds of behavior. So I happened upon the work of James Blair, who was my postdoctoral mentor, as I was writing up my dissertation, because what my dissertation found is that people who are unusually caring, who are more altruistic than usual in the lab, are really good at recognizing when other people are in distress. So if you show them a facial expression of fear, for example, they're good at just what I call empathic accuracy for that emotion, identifying what that feeling state is, which is cool, right? Because fear is an emotion that asks for help, right? That's what it's signaling is, I need help, right? And so if you're good at correctly interpreting that cue, you tend to be in other situations where you're not even seeing a face, unusually helpful. So it was kind of a weird finding. There was a paper that came out a couple years later, so after I published my dissertation, that included that finding in the most unintuitive findings in social psychology in 2007. I was like, hey, I don't think that's a compliment. But what made it make sense and made it totally intuitive was James Blair's long line of research at that point on how people who are psychopathic specifically struggle to recognize when other people are afraid. And I was like, oh, these sort of seem like complementary sets of findings. And so I was looking for a postdoctoral position. I was a little bit tired of the limitations of social psychology. I wanted to get training in brain imaging, and he was starting the first ever brain imaging research of, at that time, both adults and children who were psychopathic or at risk for psychopathy. And it was like a dream come true to get to work in that lab. It was every question I wanted to ask using every tool I'd ever wanted to try. But I'd never worked with a clinical population before. So I spent 4.5 years in my PhD program. I spent another 4.5 years at the NIMH learning how to do clinical interviewing, functional neuroimaging. We did some pharmacology research. We did some genetic research, lots of research with kids, which I'd never worked with, clinical populations. It was basically a whole second PhD is what it felt like, in all new things. the idea was we can understand the human capacity for care at all by studying this clinical population. I mean, there are different reasons. I mean, studying kids with conduct disorder is important for its own sake, right? They need help, they deserve help. Just because their symptoms manifest as hurting people does not mean they are not a group of kids who have a clinical disorder who need and deserve help, period. However, from a theoretical point of view, because of course I am a scientist, is, well, if we're interested in what makes people care about other people, it's really valuable to find groups of people who differ naturally in how caring they seem to be, and look at what's different about them, what's different about their brains, what's different about their performance on all sorts of neurocognitive tests. And that will help us understand the basic phenomena. And I'm a big believer in basic science. And if we can understand the basic phenomena, like what are the pathways that subserve the ability to care? How do they develop? What are the ways they can go awry? Why do they go awry? Then we now have a much better possibility of developing treatments that work better. So, yeah.
Thank you. I was curious because I'm always curious how people end up in like the specific fields that they end up in.
Yeah.
Like what got them there.
Right. I mean, why, like there are people who study things I think are the most boring thing in the world, but they find it fascinating. I mean, I have these two interesting stories. So I wrote a book a while ago called The Fear Factor about my research. And I have these two bookend experiences in my early 20s that I think, my teens, early 20s that I think shaped my interests. And one was being rescued by a stranger. And the other one was being like assaulted by a stranger who like punched me in the face and broke my nose in Las Vegas for New Year's 2000. And also I grew up not that far away from where Ted Bundy grew up, maybe 3 miles. So I think all of these things together contributed to my interest in, what is it that makes people care about other people? Why would anybody save a stranger at risk to their own life? Why would anybody assault a stranger who, clearly did not deserve that particular blow? So anyways, yes, all of these things I think contribute, as well as just my basic interest in what makes people tick.
I think, and our listeners should probably, one of the things that I love about you, Abby, is that you study these you study both basically the humanity spectrum, right? And so I don't think that we can understand human beings at all unless we are looking at both ends of the spectrum, right? You can't just be like, oh, these people are bad, and then not look at, the ways in which people go right. Yeah. So I love your research.
Thank you. I mean, the original research I did on altruism was funded by what's called the Positive Neuroscience Center at University of Pennsylvania. And it was started by a man named Marty Seligman, who sort of created positive psychology for that same reason, the belief that we can't understand human flourishing by just looking at clinical disorders. We have to look at both, both problems, but also when things go well, what are the roots of being really happy and flourishing? And if we want to make people flourish, we got to understand that too. And I my own personal observation is that I think it sharpens my thinking about both ends of the spectrum to have them both in mind. You can get maybe a little cynical. I think sometimes studying people who have psychopathy, it can, I think it has that risk. And I think you almost have the opposite risk in studying extremely altruistic people. You can forget that there are people in the world who really don't care about other people. They really don't. And I think you're more likely to not miss things when you're willing to consider that full spectrum. So, yeah.
Plus less burnout, right? Because you're not always like, everything isn't always serial killers and, all that stuff.
Yeah, no, yes, I think working with people who are really suffering a lot, I think does run the risk of some burnout. But I would never, I'm so glad that I study both, right? I mean, I will say studying people who were super altruistic is a wonderful line of research. I feel like I kind of lucked into it, and I just feel so fortunate to do that work, but I'm really glad that I do both. I think I find them both really interesting. I really like working with all the populations I work with, to be totally honest. So,
Well, and I would presume, as someone who doesn't study brains and know very much about them, that being able to compare across the spectrum and get a fuller picture would benefit being able to create therapeutic interventions.
Right.
Once,
I mean,
right?
yes.
Is okay.
Yeah. My lab has been working on, in the last couple of years, testing out potential interventions that can make a typical person look and act more like, look in terms of the way their brain responds, more like one of these extraordinary altruists that we work with. We haven't been successful so far because I don't think it's an easy question, right?
Right.
You know, I mean, what our research basically shows is that indeed they actually care about other people's welfare more. They place more subjective value on other people's outcomes. That's a big deal, to actually subjectively value whether somebody else is suffering or happy or at ease or in pain or whatever more. And I think the reason a lot of, people have been working on like empathy interventions for forever, and they don't really work. And I think, they work in the moment, right? It's trivially easy to make a person empathize in the moment, right? If you show almost anybody a picture of a child who's in pain or suffering, or an animal that's in pain or suffering, like most people will have an empathic response to some degree. A few people won't, but almost everybody will. But it doesn't seem to have any bearing on their behavior long term. And the reason is that we tend to empathize with people we already care about, right? We know this from brain imaging studies. If I put you in the magnet and I show you a live stream of somebody who's in pain, if you don't know them, or if you think they might even be kind of like an out group, even somebody who likes the opposite sports team as you, your sports team's rival, you won't really by default empathize with them. Most people don't. Some people do, but not everybody. But if it's somebody that you care about, right? If it's your friend, you will have a strong empathic response, right? And so what I've come to think is that the care generally precedes the empathy. They inform one another, right? If you empathize with somebody, you do tend to care about them more. But in general, you won't empathize with somebody you don't already care about. And so that's the problem with people with psychopathy, is they can empathize with certain kinds of states. Any state that you can feel, you can empathize with, right? So if you can feel pain, you can empathize with other people's pain just fine.
I love that you just said that. Any state you can feel, you can empathize with.
Yeah.
And our children have low emotionality. So, how else would it go?
Right. And so,
Right.
children who are, and adults who are psychopathic or at risk for psychopathy, have many emotional states that are relatively normal, right? If you feel disgust, pain, anger, excitement. There's and then there's what's called cognitive empathy sometimes. Different people call it different things, but understanding other people's intentions and goals and beliefs, like their thoughts more than their emotions. People who are psychopathic on average have no trouble with that. But they don't tend to consider other people's emotional states. It's not that they can't, it's that they don't. And when it comes to those kinds of states, you can do manipulations to ask them, well, try to, imagine what this person is thinking, imagine what they're feeling. And they're like, oh yeah. And then they can do it. They just don't bother on average. Now, but then there's also the emotions that people who are at risk for psychopathy don't feel as strongly as other people. Fear being a big one. And that's why they have trouble recognizing other people's fears. If you don't feel fear strongly, the best quote in the world, I think this is in my book, but, and I always, it's Essie Viting's quote. She gave it in a talk years ago, so I always credit her. So Essie Viting does very similar work on this topic as I do in the UK. But she was once upon a time testing emotion recognition, so facial expression recognition, in a population of men, I think in a prison in the UK, who had psychopathy. And one of the guys she was testing missed every single fearful facial expression in the set, which is pretty bad, even for somebody who's psychopathic. And apparently he knew he was doing badly, because he got to the last fearful expression in the set and he said, I don't know what that expression is called, but I know that's what somebody looks like right before you stab them. And so, right? And so I find that and again, that's just one guy, that's one quote, but all the evidence bears out the same thing, that people who are psychopathic have trouble recognizing fear. Why? It's a fundamental kind of emotional blindness, right? They just don't feel fear strongly on average, right? We know there's a lot of variation, but on average, people, there's the fearlessness seems to be the core, like the root of a lot of the problems we see in psychopathy.
Mhm.
And if you don't feel it yourself, right, you see that in somebody else. And like what empathy is an attempt to simulate somebody else's state, leveraging the same parts of the brain we use to feel that state. And so if you don't have, if you can't generate the fear in your brain, you can't represent it in somebody else's brain either. Love is another one, remorse, right? If you don't have these emotions strongly, then, you really, it's kind of like color blindness, right? Except it's like
Mhm.
emotion blindness for certain emotions.
I'll actually say sometimes that it's emotional color blindness.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is my son, when he was in a special day class with a bunch of high functioning, autistic children, and they would do these skills worksheets, right? And he had a 100% fail rate on all of the negative emotions for a year and a half, every single day, everything.
Wow.
100% fail of everything, which is like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's really important to convey these facts because I think it helps people understand psychopathy and its, other disorders of aggression as disorders, right? There are things they can't do. And if you can't do these things, if you cannot empathize with somebody else's fear or distress, and, it's really hard to make the same kinds of decisions. And so I have a former graduate student who's now a professor at Catholic University, Elise Cardinale, who did a whole series of studies looking at moral judgments of causing other people to feel fear and other emotions. And so we use these like brief statements that were designed to be shown to kids. And you read these statements and you try to judge what emotion would it make the person feel and how morally bad would it be to make a statement like that. And they range from statements that would elicit happiness, like you're the nicest person I know, or I bought you a present, to disgust eliciting statements. They're gross. Well, I'll leave that alone. But they're, things that kids would find gross. Sadness or anger eliciting statements, like insults, usually, like I don't want to be friends anymore, or you're an idiot, that kind of thing. And then fear eliciting statements that are threats, right? I want to make you bleed. I could hurt you if I wanted to. You better watch your back. Not subtle statements at all. And what we found now in studies in both adults and kids is that when typical people read these threat statements and are asked to understand them, they usually, say, yes, that would make somebody be afraid. And the better you are at saying, yes, a threat would make somebody feel afraid, the more you view it as immoral to make that statement, right? So it's understanding that it causes fear that is sort of that key information you need to be like, yeah, that's immoral. Whereas people who are higher in psychopathy just don't, again, and there's a strong amygdala response associated with that. So when most people read those fear eliciting statements, you see a big amygdala response, which I think is the amygdala trying to help coordinate that empathic representation of fear, right? How would this make a person feel? And you get this fear representation, and that is how you answer the question. And whereas the people with psychopathy that we looked at, both kids and adults, and the magnet were recruiting prefrontal parts of their brain to answer that question about the fear eliciting statements. They were like, they're sort of rule retrieval areas. Like, are you supposed to say that? What's the rule about this? And they were much worse at saying, at knowing that it would cause fear. And they were much more likely to say, it's basically no worse than insulting somebody, to threaten them. Whereas most people understand it's much worse to threaten them than to insult them. It's just part of the disorder. And it's not that people with psychopathy can't learn to behave appropriately. Of course they can. But it's harder, it's much harder when you don't have these strong emotional signals that most of us just automatically have.
So is the lack of fear, is that the reason that a lot of people with psychopathy can experience some things that would be horrifically traumatic to the rest of us, and they don't necessarily process it as trauma?
Yeah. It seems to be. They don't, there are plenty of, you can read plenty of, I've studied, I did a one systematic study of fear experiences in kids who had callous unemotional traits and conduct disorder, or ODD. and asked them in depth about their experiences of fear. And a couple of them said they had never felt fear in their life, and which you'll hear some adults with psychopathy say. One of them in response to one of the questions on the questionnaire she was answering, wrote hashtag nothing scares me, hashtag nothing. She was like, answering no on this questionnaire does not cover it. Nothing scares me. And then those of them who said that they had felt fear when like a tree fell on the house next door to them, or, they were chased by a dog, or like, sort of standard events they could come up with that were like, when I said, have you ever been scared? They would say these events. But then when I asked them how it felt, they would report much lower levels of sort of feelings, like less sensation in their body, and the emotional fear that they felt subjectively was just much less intense. So having really bad things happen doesn't really bother you that much. And Emmy Thomas and other adults with psychopathy who have been generous enough to explain what their experiences are like will say the same thing, that it doesn't really have much of an effect on them. So it's a little bit of a superpower if you think about it, but it's a superpower that can be used for good or bad ends. I mean, the famous psychopathy researcher David Lykken, Lykken. He's one of my favorite writers on the topic. Did a study of a lot of sort of famous people that he suspected were, had psychopathic traits, who had gone different directions with their life. And his studies suggested that probably Chuck Yeager, the test pilot, who was the first to break the sound barrier on a plane, probably had the makings of psychopathy as a child. Had that highly fearless temperament, fairly uncaring temperament. However, he discovered aviation and the Air Force early in his life and was like, I want to do that, right? Because not a guy that gets scared very easily. And he knew that he had to stay in line if he wanted to be a test pilot. And so this desire to do something very thrilling and exciting was motivation to not do the kinds of things that would get you banned from the Air Force. And so, and then he, became this sort of, in some ways, a great hero who really helped move aviation forward. So you can channel that fearless disposition in positive ways.
I would love for you to say more about the superpower part of having psychopathy, because all anybody ever says is what's bad, 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 wrong, wrong, wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's incredibly important, not just for the parents who are watching, but for the kids or people with psychopathic traits themselves. Like, there are other career paths besides supervillain, right? You are more than that thing. And it's so important that we say, well, here's what goes right with you.
Yeah.
Right. It's that spectrum thing again. What goes right, what goes wrong. It's not all bad.
Well, this is the important thing to remember about any human trait that's continuously distributed in the population, right? There's not a continuous distribution of number of arms that human beings have, right? We all basically, with very small exception, are born with 2 arms. Why? It turns out that's the optimal number of arms, right? And going way back to our like lizard ancestors, it turns out that's a really good number of top or front end limbs. There's no variation at all. Other traits, there's a huge amount of variation in the population. Everything from skin color to height is a really easy one to think about. Adiposity, body sort of size and metabolism, fearlessness, and psychopathy. And the reason you get distributions in traits in the population is because whether that trait is adaptive or not kind of depends on the context, right? And usually there's kind of a happy medium, right? I mean, we get normal distributions of lots of different traits. So, humans cluster around the average height, for example, of the population. You'll see the big bolus of people. So for women in the US, the average height is like 5'4", right? And that's, it kind of optimizes on lots of variables, like how much nutrition you need, how much food you need to survive versus, how well are you able to accomplish the tasks of adulthood? And then you get really small, women like me, because fewer, but the reason there's a range is that different environments select for different traits, and so you get this distribution because in some environments it is adaptive to be really small, like very low resource environments, very adaptive, and in other environments being really tall is adaptive. And so that's true for personality traits as well. Like, sometimes there are environments in which it's adaptive to be really low in fear, and environments it's adaptive, especially very dangerous environments, in which it's adaptive to be very sensitive to scary things so you don't get killed. And I think the same is true for psychopathy. You could make an argument that in some environments, in some contexts, in some cultures, being super caring and pro-social is probably the most adaptive, but usually it's, being somewhere in the middle has its benefits too. And then there's some environments in which being relatively low on these traits is probably adaptive. So yeah, I think there are ways to channel these traits in positive directions, just like there's a way to channel every trait in a positive direction. If you're like a super high fear sensitive person, like you don't want to be a bomb diffuser. I think you're a bomb, whoever's the person that diffuses the bombs.
Yeah. I would be a danger to everyone.
That's a bad career choice. Don't do that. Don't pick something where you're going to be jumping out of your skin all day, right? But if you're a really low fear person, not too low, right? If you're too low fear, you're going to make dumb mistakes. Like a little bit of fear is probably good. So maybe if you're like completely fearless, you also don't want to go into a job where you need that fear to keep you safe. Or maybe you just want to know that about yourself. If you have good insight, you're like, I do not avoid things that are dangerous as much as I should, but I can use my logic to overcome that bias. That's possible. That's probably what Chuck Yeager did, right? He didn't crash. So he must, even though he had a pretty fearless temperament, he was able to work around them.
Well, and I think if you don't push yourself kind of towards the edge of your limits, you don't know what your limits are.
Exactly.
Right? Like they need it's farther for them.
None of us, that's what I tell my students all the time. I'm like, we don't all have the same capabilities. We know that, right? We're all different. Amazing, right? Thank God. Humans are incredibly diverse and variable, and we all have some amount of potential in any given area that we don't know what it is, right? Until we try it. And that's why you got to try a lot of things, and some things just aren't the right fit, and maybe that's not the path for you, but everybody has things that they can be good at. So you just got to try. Yeah. And, I wouldn't say like right offhand, if I had to think like, what are the perfect jobs for people who have higher levels of psychopathy? I can think of, the problem is if you take it too far on the spectrum, it's bad no matter what. So some people are like, like recon military groups that are in a lot of danger. I'm like, yes, but you still gonna have you don't want to commit war crimes. That's bad. And intelligence officers, for example, an intelligence agency, that's very dangerous work, and you don't get to form strong bonds, and it's pretty hard to have a family. And it's not impossible, but that's a tricky line of work. And in theory, that could be good too, but you really need to not be a turncoat. You need to not be, you do have to have some loyalty to the company you start with or to the country that you start with. So anyways, there's definitely, I can think of lots of options.
Do you think there's any areas where they typically, from what you've seen, tend to flourish more? Is there something that you've seen that they most people tend to do better with, school, jobs, anything?
People who are high in psychopathy, what are the kinds of jobs that they would do best at?
Or even
I don't know if there's been systematic study of that. I do think there are some leadership positions that you could be, I think that there is a natural sort of, when you have that kind of bold, socially dominant personality, that lends itself very well to leadership, but the key thing is you have to learn to keep those somewhat self-centered tendencies in check, because those will get you over the long term. So I think it's all about, learning ways to moderate the less pro-social features. But I think, lots of dangerous or risky or, sort of leadership related positions could 100% be good. But, with a huge asterisk, you don't want to be that firefighter who's going out committing arson, just so you can go have fun putting out fires. That's way more common than most people realize. There's an unusual number of arsonists among the firefighting community.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so surprising.
Most firefighters are not, obviously. Most firefighters like to fight fires and do the right thing. But people who are attracted to fighting fires like fire. Yes, there have been some cases out there of firefighters who are committing arson so that then they can go have fun fighting the fires. So, you don't want that. That's bad.
Do you think some of
that But the thing is, I can think of people who are psychopathic who are in every profession under the sun, because the thing is, psychopathy is just one piece of your personality,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
You have all the other traits that you've got, and there's 1,000 different ways that you can make that kind of temperament work for you, by realizing that it can be a strength or a weakness, and learning how to manage the impulses to do things that are less prosocial.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And to be sure you never miss an upload, make sure you turn your notifications on. And please come join us on social media so we can continue these conversations in between episodes. You'll find us at Hypoxia Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.